Hello, I'm Hassan Ajami. I'm a Lebanese author and a freelance journalist. I also teach Arabic language and Arab Islamic culture at Thunderbird School of Global Management. Today, the topic is Arab Islamic culture and communication. But before seeing the relationship between the Arab Islamic culture and communication, it would be appropriate to repeat something that we mentioned previously concerning the communication pattern in the West in comparison to the communication pattern in the Arab Islamic culture. As we said previously, in the West, communication is transmission of information, such that information is equal to surprise over the probability of the occurrence of the message. But in the Arab Islamic culture, communication is transmission of information, such that information is equal to the probability of the occurrence of the message over surprise. So in the West, surprise should be maximum in order to have maximum information, therefore successful communication. But in the Arab Islamic culture, surprise should be minimum in order to have maximum information and therefore successful communication. In this sense, the communication pattern in the Arab Islamic culture is the opposite of the communication pattern in the West. In the West, surprise should be maximum, but in the Arab Islamic culture, surprise should be minimum. Now we'll concentrate on the Arab Islamic culture to see the relationship between the Arab Islamic culture and the communication pattern accepted by most of the Arabs and the Muslims. As we know, the Arab Islamic culture is a high context culture in many different senses. In one sense, the Arab Islamic culture is a high context culture in the sense that each word has high significance with many levels of connotations and meanings. But why? So the question is, why is the Arab Islamic culture a high context culture in this sense? In fact, the communication pattern accepted and followed by most of the Arabs and Muslims explains why the Arab Islamic culture is a high context culture. Let's concentrate on the Arab culture, of course. In the Arab culture, the probability of the occurrence of Arabic words is maximum, of course, because we speak Arabic in the Arab culture. So the probability of the occurrence of Arabic words is maximum. And the surprise is minimum. If my Arab friends, Arab neighbors talk to me in Arabic, I will not be surprised. And therefore, it follows mathematically that the information within each Arabic word would be maximum, as it is given in this formula. Therefore, the fact that the Arabs and the Muslims follow this communication pattern led the Arab Islamic culture to be a high context culture in the sense that each word has high significance with many levels of connotations and meanings. Let us provide a certain example here, which is, for example, ahlan, which we mentioned previously. Ahlan means welcome, but it comes from ahl, which is family. Therefore, when I tell you ahlan, I'm telling you welcome, but at the same time, I'm telling you that you're part of my family, and therefore family values should control our relationship, and ultimately, family values should control the society itself. Here, this is an example of how a single word in Arabic has high significance with many levels of connotations and meanings. So why is it so? Because of the communication pattern followed by most of the Arabs and the Muslims. So here it is implied in what I said that the communication pattern followed by most of the Arabs and the Muslims in fact is forming, and indeed it formed Arabic language itself. It made Arabic language a high context language due to this communication pattern. The second point is that the Arab Islamic culture is a past-oriented culture in the sense that past traditions prevail and the decisions are taken in light of the past merits. And the same question is, why is the Arab Islamic culture a past-oriented culture? In fact, the communication pattern followed by most of the Arabs and the Muslims explains why the Arab Islamic culture is a past-oriented culture. If we look at the past itself, the past is already established. Therefore, surprise in the past is minimum. And also, we can't change the past, obviously. We can't change the past, obviously. And therefore, surprise in the past is minimum. But according to the Arab Islamic communication pattern, surprise should be minimum. So given the fact that according to the Arab Islamic communication pattern, surprise is minimum, it is required to be minimum, and given the fact that in the past surprise is minimum, therefore the communication pattern followed by most of the Arabs and the Muslims led the Arab Islamic culture to be a past-oriented culture. The third point is that the Arab Islamic culture is a reactive culture. It is a reactive culture in the sense that most Arabs and Muslims consider change to be bad and dangerous, and imitation and improvement are better than innovation. The same question is, why is the Arab Islamic culture a reactive culture in this sense? The communication pattern followed by most of the Arabs and the Muslims explains why the Arab Islamic culture is a reactive culture. If we look at change itself, change contains maximum surprise because we can't precisely predict the results and consequences of change. Therefore, change contains maximum surprise. And therefore, change contradicts the communication pattern followed by most of the Arabs and the Muslims. Because according to this communication pattern, according to the Arab Islamic communication pattern, surprise should be minimum. But in change, surprise is maximum. Therefore, change contradicts the communication pattern followed by most of the Arabs and the Muslims. And therefore, the communication pattern followed by most of the Arabs and the Muslims led the Arab Islamic culture to be a reactive culture in the sense of considering change as bad and dangerous. The fourth point is that the Arab Islamic culture is a risk avoidance culture. Most Arabs and Muslims avoid risk, avoid taking risk. They consider risk as bad and dangerous, and most of them are uncomfortable with risk and uncertainty. But why? Why is the Arab Islamic culture a risk avoidance culture in this sense? Also, the communication pattern followed by most of the Arabs and Muslims explains why. If we look at risk, in risk itself, surprise is maximum, because also we can't precisely predict the results of taking a risk. So surprise is maximum in risk, and therefore risk itself contradicts the communication pattern followed by most of the Arabs and the Muslims. Because according to the communication pattern followed by most of the Arabs and the Muslims, surprise should be minimum, but risk contains maximum surprise. Therefore, risk itself contradicts the communication pattern followed by most of the Arabs and the Muslims, and therefore the communication pattern followed by most of the Arabs and the Muslims led the Arab Islamic culture to be a risk avoidance culture. Point 5 now. The Arab Islamic culture is a collectivistic culture. In a collectivistic culture, one identifies oneself with the group and thinks and behaves as one's group does. And therefore, in a collectivistic culture, surprise is minimum because I'm just behaving as others are doing in my group. I'm thinking exactly as they think, so surprise is minimum in a collectivistic culture. But the communication pattern followed by most of the Arabs and the Muslims requires that surprise should be minimum. Therefore, the fact that most of the Arabs and the Muslims follow this communication pattern, which requires that surprise is minimum, and the fact that, and given the fact that in a collectivistic culture, surprise is minimum, therefore, this communication pattern followed by most of the Arabs and the Muslims led the Arab Islamic culture to be a collectivistic culture. All of this shows that the communication patterns form cultures. If you adopt different communication patterns, the result would be different cultures. Here, the Arab Islamic communication pattern indicated in this equation explains why the Arab Islamic culture is a high context culture, past-oriented culture, reactive culture, risk avoidance culture, and a collectivistic culture. Now, we'll take just one example concerning the Western culture and see how the communication pattern in the West forms the Western culture itself. As we know, the Western culture is a future-oriented culture. In the West, we think in terms of the future. We take our decisions in light of what might occur in the future. So the Western culture is a future-oriented culture. But why? The communication pattern followed in the West explains why the Western culture is a future-oriented culture. According to the communication pattern in the West,
surprise should be maximum in order to have maximum information and therefore successful communication. But in the future, surprise is maximum. Therefore, the communication pattern followed in the West led the Western culture to be a future-oriented culture. Here in this argument, we have an assumption, which is that in the future, surprise is maximum, and we have to justify it. Of course, and the justification is the following. We can't precisely predict what will happen. We can't precisely predict what will happen in the future, and therefore, obviously, surprise is maximum in the future. And therefore, being a futuristic or being future-oriented culture coheres perfectly with the communication pattern followed in the West. Because according to the communication pattern followed in the West, surprise should be maximum, and surprise is in fact maximum in the future. Therefore, this communication pattern led the Western culture to be a future-oriented culture. Thank you for listening.